Hi, welcome to the Aruba OS 8.3 how-to video series. This is going to be the second video in a 15-part series that goes through the initial setup of Aruba OS 8.3 and setting up the Mobility Master, mobility controllers that are managed by the Mobility Master, and a number of other functions that are established through the configuration of the Mobility Master and managing an Aruba OS 8.3 deployment. From the last video, we did a quick tutorial over VMware and the initial VMware setup, and so that you can see that I've got my 4 virtual mobility controllers that are going to be a part of my architecture, then I've got my 3 mobility masters. This is what the architecture is going to look like that we set up. You can see that I have 2 mobility masters in redundancy at DC1, and then I will have a backup mobility master over layer 3 in DC2. Additionally, I will have 2 controllers in each data center that will be terminating some APs on each side, and then we'll go through the configuration of how to set these up for redundancy. So first things first, we're going to log into the first mobility master. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. The first thing to do is to go ahead and click power on. This will actually initialize the device, and then from here I will go and click on the console tab. Now what you'll see first here is this booting into AOS P0. If you want to save yourself 20 seconds or so, you can go ahead and hit enter. And these are the 2 partitions that exist on the controller. And so we're going to go ahead and boot into partition 0, so I'll just hit enter. So it's going to take a few minutes for this guy to boot up. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while it boots up, and we'll come back after it's done. So now that the Mobility Master has booted up, this is the first page that you see. This is essentially the initial configuration script. So from the network drawing, you can see that I want to name this MM1. So what I'll do is we'll name this 8.3 MM1. Now this VLAN ID is going to define what VLAN this is put in. We know from the network drawing here that this is all in VLAN 200. So I'm going to go ahead and say the VLAN is 200. Remember, this is network adapter 1. And so this is the interface that I actually want to use that I left enabled. I'm going to go ahead and leave this an access port. You could make it a trunk port if you need to carry multiple VLANs to the Mobility Master. But generally speaking, most of the time the Mobility Master will be a single VLAN device. The IP address is 192.168.200.51. That is the right net mask. The gateway is 254. I'm not going to configure any IPv6. The country code is US. And then the time zone for me is America, Denver. The time here is approximately correct, so that's 14:12. It's actually 14:14 and 30. That is the right date. I'm going to go ahead and give it a password for the admin account, and everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and hit yes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this guy reboots. I'll go ahead and do the initial config for the other Mobility Master, then we'll come back to set up the other one. Okay, so I have gone into and stood up. If we look at all the virtual machines, I've gone in and I've turned on all the Mobility Masters, and so I'll go ahead and log into all of them. We can do a show IP interface brief. You can see that this one is 200.51. If I log into this guy, this should be 200.52, and he does. And I want to make sure that he can ping. So make sure I did everything correct. That looks good. This guy just finished coming up. If I do a show IP interface brief, you can see he's 150.151, and so if I want to ping MM1, I can do it from here. So I know that all my network connectivity between the Mobility Masters are all good. Now there's some other steps to go ahead and set up the MM redundancy. Those will come in a later video, but generally speaking, deploying a Mobility Master or deploying a virtual mobility controller are all more or less the same thing. It's the same startup script for the most part. I will point out, we'll go ahead and turn this guy on just because it'll be worth showing. So having now powered on the virtual mobility controller, what I want to do, I'm not going to actually run through the startup script to finality, but I do want to show that there is a difference between the Mobility Master and the mobility controller startup scripts that are relevant to your deployment. And so for example, when we look at this deployment here, I have 2 Mobility Masters in redundancy at layer 2. Their virtual IP address will be .50. I'm also going to have a layer 3 backup MM as part of this demo config that exists somewhere else. And so there's a number of things that the startup script asks for on a virtual mobility controller that aren't asked for in a mobility master, but should be able to kind of help indicate what you want to have set up first before you start doing your mobility controller configs. Now you can always go back and change a lot of these settings if you need to. For example, if you add a layer 3 mobility master later, you can go ahead and do that. If you need to change the IP address of the mobility master that the mobility controllers use, you can change that later as well. However, it's more efficient to make sure that if you're going to go ahead and set up a certain amount of redundancy in your architecture or in your deployment, that you want to go ahead and have all the mobility masters deployed first. So for this guy, I will just name him, let me click in here, we'll just call him 8.3, and this is VMCA1. Now, the difference between standalone and managed device is a standalone would be a controller that's not talking to the mobility master. MD would be a managed device that is, and so we're going to leave him as an MD. I'm going to use IPv4. And then what I would do is I would enter the IP address of my primary mobility master switch IP address, which in this case is going to be the VRP address between MM1 and MM2, which is .50. I am not, or this is not a VPNC. That's covered in a separate video or a separate instruction guide, and this is not going through a VPNC to get to the mobility master, so I'm going to say no for both. The master is virtual, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes. It's going to ask for a PSK with IP, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'll enter my passphrase here. This is going to be essentially what secures the IPsec communication between the managed device or the mobility controller and the mobility master. I would make sure that you go ahead and pick something fairly strong. I wouldn't just use Aruba 123 or something similar unless it's your lab and you don't really care. Now, you'll notice here it asks you if you want to enable L3 redundancy. Now again, you can always go back and do this later, but if so, it's going to ask for the IP address of the layer 3 mobility master, which in this case is 150.51. And it does not go through a virtual mobility controller, so I'll say no. It is a virtual, so I will say yes. And then it asks for the PSK with IP. I want to go ahead and use the same passphrase. It's going to ask for the uplink VLAN. I'm going to go ahead and say 200 because that's where this guy lives. That interface, I'm going to go ahead and call this a trunk port. The native VLAN ID will be 200. The IP assignment is static. If you wanted to do DHCP or PPPoE, you could go ahead and select that as well. This is going to be 192.168.200.61. Netmask, the gateway is 200.254. My IP address for the DNS server is 100.2. I'm not going to configure any IPv6. This is not really relevant on a virtual controller, but for a physical hardware controller, you may want to go ahead and set up a dynamic port channel first, but I'm going to go ahead and say no. The country code is US. It's going to ask for the time zone, America, Denver. The time is 14:32 in 30 seconds. That is the right date. I'm going to go ahead and create an admin account. Now again, you don't have to create an admin account on the managed devices, but it's generally advised to do so. Now, this is essentially the elements that are different within a virtual mobility controller, where it asks for example, whether it's going through a VPNC, whether there is a layer 3 mobility master that needs to be pointed at, if you want to set up a static port channel. But everything else, for the most part, is exactly the same. Now you'll notice I can go ahead and hit no, and it's going to restart from the beginning. So if at any point you're running through the startup script and you realize you want to wait a little bit, you don't necessarily have to commit to it. And if you mess up one specific setting and you go ahead and hit enter and you realize, oh, I didn't actually want to do that, you can either do a Control B to go back one level, or you can go ahead and do a Control X to just go ahead and start all over. If you're going through this setup and you have any other questions, certainly reach out to any of the online resources like community.arubanetworks.com, or you can reach out to your local Aruba SE or partner. Thank you.